Welcome to Podcast, the Business of Dentistry podcast, brought to you by Practice Plan. Podcast delivers the best business advice, real-life stories, and practical hints and tips to make your practice a more profitable and sustainable business. And now, here's your host.
Hello and welcome to this latest edition of the In the Loop podcast series with me, Nigel Jones. I'm one of the directors of the Practice Plan group of companies, and I use these podcasts as a way of exploring topics of interest to the dental profession and the world of dentistry in the wider UK. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Lauren Harrhy today. Hello, Lauren.
Hi, Nigel. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And what we're going to be talking about today is what's happening in Wales in terms of negotiations around the NHS contract for dentistry. And I think that's particularly interesting for practices based in England as well, because it's not just going to directly impact people in Wales, although obviously that'll happen. I'm absolutely certain that people will be watching with interest as to how things develop in Wales as an indicator of what might happen in England, given the broad similarities currently and historically between the two contracts. So I'm very grateful to you for spending some time with us today, Lauren. So I wonder if you could perhaps just introduce yourself, let us know your roles so that the listeners can understand where your perspective is coming from, and then just give us a bit of an insight into the current state of play.
Okay, thanks, Nigel. So I've got my main role, apart from being a practice owner and a GDP, I sit on the BDA Executive Committee, the Principal Executive Committee, the PEC. And I take the Welsh seat there. Prior to being re-elected to the PEC, I was part of the Welsh General Dental Practice Committee as a voting member. And as part of my role on that, I was one of the negotiation team in the tripartite negotiations with Welsh Government and the NHS in Wales to try to develop a new contract. Those negotiations ended without agreement September, October 2024, but they've been going on for about 18 months prior to that.
Yeah, well, I think that puts you in pretty much pole position to be able to offer a view on how things are going. So now they put out a contractual framework for consultation. What's your initial take on things?
I think, well, the initial take from the profession, and I would reflect that, is that the relationship between our historic patient base and the practice is at risk. So the way that the consultation looks to be planning the new contract is that patients who become stable will be returned to a centralised waiting list for each health board area until they're due to have their next dental checkup. Now, we don't know what the demand is. Welsh Government don't know what the demand is either. So we don't know how long that waiting list will be. Obviously, if you're in a health board area where there aren't that many NHS practices, but there are plenty of people, that waiting list will be very long and access back into dental practices will be tricky. There are other parts of the consultation that will present challenges to NHS practices in Wales. There are good things to highlight as well. Obviously, the aims of the contract are to make it so that it is more accessible, hopefully, for patients to gain entry into NHS care, and it should also feel, if it works properly, like the treatments that we're doing are recognised and remunerated more appropriately. Now, that doesn't mean that there's more money, but it means that psychologically you feel that you're not doing molar endo for free, sort of thing. Another feature of the consultation is that the PCR collection, the patient charge revenue collection, is to be taken out of the practices, which has had mixed reviews. I thought it was quite a positive, because essentially we end up as tax collectors for the government, and all the problems that kind of come along with that: blue forms, patients not knowing if they're NHS or private, and also obviously our card machines and our banking fees mean that we never actually get our full contract value, while we're collecting money that we essentially give out or have withheld from the health boards. So pros and cons that I'm happy to explore in a little bit more detail as we go along, if you like.
Yeah, well, you've already raised a number of interesting things. So perhaps, well, the centralised patient waiting list. I've been trying to work out what that will mean for continuity of care, and as far as I can tell, everything I've read tells me that continuity of care is quite important. But this seems like quite an efficient way of doing things, but not necessarily an effective way if continuity of care is important. Would that be an appropriate thought?
I think so. I think that it's so that the centralised waiting list. I'll give you the name that they call in the access point is the direct access portal. So the DAP is the way that we're sort of referring to it in Wales. So I think that the DAP, sort of in overall terms, seems like a great idea, that patients register with the DAP online, and then when availability becomes or capacity becomes available at an NHS practice within the health board, they can have an appointment with that practice. The practicality is that managing the DAP is quite an enormous task for the health boards, like an administrative burden on the health board, and it means that patients who don't have very good access to transport will find it difficult to move between practices, I think.
Yeah.
So that equity of care, I think, is going to be tricky. And I think as practices hand their contracts in, we'll see that those waiting lists become longer.
Well, and you touch on an interesting point there in terms of practices handing contracts back in, because I guess a lot of people will struggle from a patient care perspective with the sort of setup, and there's also for me this question mark about goodwill and what that breaking continuity means in terms of patient loyalty, and what that means for the value of people's businesses and things. Is it your sense that people will hand back contracts?
Absolutely. There's no doubt that there will be practices who will look at this contract and think that it is not for them, that they have spent years, decades building up goodwill with their patients, a loyal patient base who they enjoy looking after, and I think that this puts that at significant risk.
Yeah, I mean, that there's almost a sense, and I know it suits my commercial agenda, but I try to detach that from conversations like this and just look at it. But there's almost a sense that actually, if you just go with the contract and see how it goes, what you might find is a dilution of your goodwill that reduces your ability to go private in the future. So I guess it focuses the mind of a lot of people right now.
Absolutely right. I think that I've had a bit of a flavour of this already, because I did reduce my contract a couple of years ago, and has been lower than I expected because my patients were reallocated to other practices. So patients that I'd been looking after for whatever it was, eight years to that point, quite a few of them thought, oh, it's okay, I've got a place at another NHS practice. They didn't understand or appreciate, because why would they? Patients don't understand the workings of this. That the way that contract variation has worked in Wales is that they weren't going to get seen that quickly or that often. So I've kind of had a flavour of the breakdown in goodwill that can happen when patients feel that they're on a waiting list somewhere already. So I think the problem with this that I foresee is that unless patients are made aware of the fact that the DAP is going to mean that it's long, potentially inconvenient for appointments for them, and that they won't get to see the same dentist every time, which is important to patients. They will think, well, that's okay because I'm on an NHS waiting list, and that might discourage them from picking up private dental treatment where it might have been the more appropriate thing for them.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting concept, and yeah, it'd be fascinating to see how that actually plays out in reality. And you mentioned about the patient charge revenue and the pros and cons of that, and certainly the observation you made about being taxpayers is one I've heard many times during the course of my career, and that certainly is the way that it feels, and it's an interesting additional perspective, the point about fees involved in transactions to collect that. So if some people are not so comfortable with it, why would that be?
I think just because on behalf of the patients, really, that they want to know sort of how it will work for those who generally like to deal in cash. I think that if it goes to sort of a centralised payment system, how I think the problem is that we don't know the details. We don't know how it's going to work practically. How will we know whether or not the patient's paid? Are we authorised to treat them yet? If a patient presents to me today, what do I do with them? Do I go ahead and treat them? Have they paid in advance? If that's gone to a centralised system, how well is that updated? Is it being updated in real time? Or will I end up sort of having to just suck it up and take the cost on myself if the patient hasn't paid the health boards? So I think that we could do with some clarification really on that detail. But I mean, personally, I think that if it is managed well, then this could be a good thing for practices.
Yes, yeah, I can see that conceptually it could help, but if it's not actually executed well, then it could make things worse. So you touched on another important point there, which is about clarity, and I guess the devil can be in the detail. What's your sense of because it's been put out to consultation, is there sufficient clarity for the profession to give a view?
I think my answer would be not yet. So we do have plans as BDA Wales to ask for some further points of clarification to be discussed really. However, the CDO and one of the civil servants who's been involved in writing this document, they have offered to come out or to have online meetings with all 7 LDCs. So I think that that'll be a useful time for us to ask questions for anything that isn't understood presently.
Okay, yeah, and so you've drawn attention to the DAP and then the patient charge revenue point. What other areas do you think the profession should be thinking about as they mull over this proposal?
I think there will be far tighter controls by health boards. So instead of 3 months notice to quit this contract, the proposals are that it'll be a 6-month notice period. So if you are going to try it and see, then you need to be aware that it's now 6 months if it doesn't work out, rather than 3 to quit. I think that the 40% target by 6 months is going to be a little bit tricky, because we'll be seeing patients with quite high needs, and we know that courses of treatment are only counted when they're finished. And I know, because I'm in a high needs area, that courses of treatment on these types of patients can take the full contract year and beyond sometimes. Um,
And
so
so
I
for
think
clarity,
that,
Lauren, that the 40% is 40% of the activity that's expected.
yeah, yes, 40% of our metrics must be achieved by mid-year, or you risk the health board unilaterally deciding to reduce the contract value.
Right. So the idea of working incredibly hard in the last quarter doesn't apply anymore.
Not anymore. And I think, you know, that is something that does happen, but more often than not, it's that, particularly, as I say, if you're in an area of high needs, or you're working on very high needs patients, it might have taken you that whole year to get through that course of treatment. So it doesn't necessarily follow that, you know, all activity just happens in that last quarter. And I do understand why it's prudent to have activity sort of spread along the whole contract year, but that doesn't kind of reflect the nuances of what happens at the coal face, does it?
Yeah.
You know, and also we've got to consider that a practice might have a dentist on maternity leave for that first half of the year, and the rest of the dentists are doing their best to sort of try and keep the contract running along. And I know we should have locums, but actually that's not always possible in this climate. Not everybody wants to work in the NHS or locum in the NHS. And will they be working as rapidly as your usual dentist? Things like that. You know, practices do face difficulties throughout any financial year, as any small business will. And I think that we should be allowed to manage those targets. So long as we hit them, we should be allowed to manage those targets as we need to.
But you touch on, I think, a really important point that seems to be relevant right the way across the UK at the moment, which is the workforce issue and the availability of clinicians, full stop, let alone clinicians willing to work on the NHS. And if some, and it might be a significant proportion, decide to hand their contracts back. I mean, most of my experience of working with dentists going private is that they see broadly half the number of patients they were seeing before and spend twice as much time per patient. So, but that, for every dentist that hands their contract back, that means that half their patient base is being added to the DAP. So it feels it's going to be quite difficult to improve access, even if the process would appear to do that. Is there going to be the workforce available to do it?
Yeah, that's another significant concern, and it is something that we frequently look at the BDA, and I know that HEIW in Wales are looking at it, and you know, broadly the rest of the UK too. We are fortunate in the UK that we have actually quite a high proportion of dentists for our population compared to other countries, but not everybody works full time, and not everybody works within clinical practice. So although, you know, technically we do have plenty of dentists, not all of them are doing, you know, face-to-face dentistry. And I fully can see where you're going with the fact that we are going to see a dip in access more broadly. That, you know, each practice that hands back will also be handing back quite a significant number of patients. So yeah, access not just to NHS dentistry, but dentistry generally is likely to take a hit, and that might be an unintended consequence.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems to me that the part of the challenge can be the ability of NHS practices to attract associates, and you're absolutely right about the trend for working fewer clinical hours, and we observe that right the way across all of the, and we work with about 3,000 practices, and you see that constantly. So it seems to me that it's going to be a real challenge for an NHS practice to be able to afford to attract or keep associates, especially when faced with the competition that can come from some of their private practices. So although it feels to me like it's a problem right the way across dentistry, including private practice, it'll be more acute in practices, particularly those where their NHS income is going to be limited. And again, is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, and I think, Nigel, you've been doing this a long time, so have I. We know that that has always been the case, for a number of years now, and certainly since the 2006 contract came in, practices have found it increasingly difficult to attract associates to help them perform the contracts. And what has happened over that time is that practices have either been subject to significant clawback, or they've had to reduce their contracts and therefore reduce access. So yeah, I think that challenge will become really quite pressing and ever more acute within the next couple of years.
So we're coming to the end of our allotted time, Lauren. What sort of in summary, what do you think is likely to play out? I mean, obviously you mentioned about the CDO meeting with the LDCs and hopefully giving some of the clarity that's needed. But what do you think is likely to play out in Wales, and how do you see that being perceived in the rest of the UK, but particularly England?
Personally, and this is just a personal view, I think that we will probably see fewer independent practices being able to offer NHS work, and that corporate practices may be able to do that more effectively for longer, because of the economies of scale. But I think we will probably see that many independent practices will feel that this has been just a step too far. Most of us got into dentistry to look after a particular cohort of patients that we've come to care deeply about, actually. Not, I mean, you've probably had this conversation lots and lots of times when practices decide to go private. The biggest concern is what happens to our patients. Now, if we are interrupting that continuity of care and interrupting that relationship between dentist and patient, then a lot of us will probably think, well, what are we doing it for? Most of us want to look after those people that we've been looking after for such a long time. And if that means that we have to go private to do that, then I think that many will make that choice.
Yes, I think that's such an important point. And I remember very early on in my career in the 90s, having a conversation with a dentist who said that he felt he had a choice between delivering the best quality patient care he could, or being loyal to the ideals of the NHS that weren't matched by reality. And I suspect that's where a lot of your colleagues in Wales will be at now. It's going to be an interesting time, I think, Lauren.
I think so. And Nigel, I think that's so poignant what you've just said, and those ideals of the NHS are what clinicians have been we've been idealistically trying to work towards those for so long, haven't we? And I think that successive governments have relied upon that, that we have these ideals, and that all of us want to prop up the NHS and make it work, and we have tried to do that for so long. But yeah, it doesn't feel like it is the right thing always. But practitioners go through that grief process a little bit, don't they, when they decide to give their contracts back in, and you can see why, because the NHS ideals are what most of us in healthcare would like to be working towards.
Yeah, and certainly throughout my career, you're absolutely right. I've had that kind of conversation so many times, and which is why people have to make these kind of decisions for themselves. We can't sort of bully or pressurize people into it. It's about providing information to allow them to make what's right for them, because they've got to feel it's the right thing to do for all the reasons you've just so well articulated. And there comes a point, I think, where and it's the old cliche about the oxygen mask, where the trouble is, if you're sort of trying so hard to look after other people, actually your health can suffer. You know, there's so many things that could then ultimately lead to you letting patients down at your own personal cost, that there have to be limits, and it's just for people to judge whether or not they've reached those limits.
Absolutely. I mean, I've recently put a post out about only dentists and their teams can do what we do. There are no other parts of healthcare that can just step in and do dentistry. So each dentist that we lose is an enormous loss of skills and training and experience. And yeah, each one of us that is at risk of suspension by the GDC or erasure by the GDC, or having to leave the profession due to poor mental or physical health because we've been out. Those are losses that are not easily replaced, and I think that that's something for us all to bear in mind, really, that if you lose a dentist or you lose a practice from the community, then those patients have no access.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great note on which to bring this conversation to an end. Thank you so much, Lauren. I hope we get to speak again when things become a little clearer, and we can see how the profession in Wales is reacting to it. But thank you so much for giving up your time today. I really very much appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Nigel.